A soft, warm Miami breeze caressed my face as I walked down the stone path toward the nursing home where my grandfather Henry resided. It was one of those spring afternoons that seemed eternal, with the sun shining brightly in the blue sky, not a cloud in sight. I had promised myself to visit my grandfather more often, especially after his health began to decline. He had always been an enigmatic figure in my life, a man of few words but of deep looks and full of untold stories. Upon entering the nursing home, I was greeted by the familiar scent of lavender and the soothing sound of classical music playing in the background. The walls were adorned with paintings of bucolic landscapes and old photos of the residents. I walked down the hall until I reached Henry's room. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, with a thick leather-bound book on his lap. His eyes, once vibrant, now looked tired, but there was still a gleam of recognition when he saw me. "Lucas, my boy," he said with a faint but warm smile. "I'm glad you came." "Hi, Grandpa," I replied, leaning in to give him a hug. "How are you feeling today?" "Oh, the days are long, but I'm fine. You know how it is." He gestured with his hand, as if pushing away an imaginary cloud. "And you? How is the work in the office?" We talked for a few minutes about trivia, and then I decided it was time to organize his belongings, something he had asked me to do some time ago. I started with the books, a vast collection that took up almost the entire wall of his room. As I pulled the volumes from the bookshelf, a particularly old and worn book caught my eye. It was a collection of poetry by Pablo Neruda. When opening the book, an envelope yellowed by time slid out and fell to the floor. I picked it up carefully, feeling the fragile texture of the paper under my fingers. The envelope was sealed, but the name Margaret was written in an elegant and firm handwriting. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Grandpa, what's that?" I asked, showing him the envelope. Henry looked up, and when he saw the letter, his expression changed. He seemed to have been transported to another time, another place. "Oh, Margaret," he muttered, almost like a sigh. I didn't know that letter still existed. I sat next to him, holding the letter as if it were a precious treasure. "Who's Margaret?" I asked, trying to disguise my curiosity. Henry was silent for a moment, as if deciding whether or not he should share that part of his life with me. Finally, he began to speak, his voice charged with emotion. "Margaret was the great love of my life. I met her when I was young, even before I met her grandmother. She was a jazz singer in Miami, and I was just a guy trying to find my way in life. We fell madly in love, but circumstances separated us." He paused, his eyes lost in old memories. "I wrote this letter to her decades ago, when I realized that I would never forget her. But I never had the courage to send it." I opened the envelope carefully and began to read the letter aloud. Henry's words were poetic, full of love and longing. He described how Margaret had changed his life, how his eyes shone in the spotlight as she sang, and how he missed her every day. When I finished reading, my eyes were dizzy. I looked at my grandfather, who was also visibly moved. "Grandpa, why did you never tell anyone about this?" I asked, my voice a little shaky. "I thought it was better that way. Life took its course, and I ended up marrying your grandmother, but I never stopped loving Margaret." I buried those feelings deep in my heart, thinking it was the best thing to do. I was silent for a few moments, absorbing everything he had said. The idea that my grandfather, a man who always seemed so reserved and restrained, had such an intense and tragic love story, touched me deeply. "Grandpa, I want to know more about her," he said finally. "I want to understand this part of your life." Henry looked at me with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "I would be happy to share what I know, Lucas, but I don't know if you will find many answers. Margaret is long gone." "I know, but something tells me I need to do this," I replied, feeling a determination grow inside me. "Maybe it's a way to better understand who you are, and even who I am." He nodded slowly. "If that's what you want, then go for it. I just ask that if you find anything, tell me." We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about Margaret. Henry told me about the nights spent in jazz clubs, about the long walks by the sea, and about the dreams they shared of a future together. Every detail painted a more vivid picture of that lost love, and my curiosity only increased. When I finally said goodbye, I promised Henry that I would be back soon with more information. I left the nursing home with Margaret's letter in my pocket and a sense of renewed purpose. I decided that I would begin my search immediately. The next day, I took time off from the law office and started investigating. The first stop was the Miami Public Library, where I spent hours looking for any mention of a jazz singer named Margaret from the 1950s. I found some old newspaper articles that mentioned a Margaret Rose, a talented singer who regularly performed at local jazz clubs. I armed myself with this information and began to visit the jazz clubs that still existed in the city. Many had closed, but some were still in operation, preserving Miami's rich musical history. At each club, I asked the veteran musicians and older regulars if they knew Margaret Rose. It was in one of these clubs, a small cozy place called the Blue Note, that I found the first significant clue. An elderly saxophonist named Joe remembered Margaret well. "Ah, Margaret Rose," he said with a wistful smile. "She was a star, boy. He had a voice that could melt anyone's heart. I played with her a few times. A true lady." I told Joe about my grandfather Henry and the letter he had found. He listened intently, shaking his head from time to time. "Yes, I remember Henry," he said finally. He was always around, following Margaret like a shadow. We all knew he was in love with her. "Do you know what happened to her?" I asked, my anxiety evident in my voice. Joe sighed. "I don't know much, boy. She suddenly disappeared and no one else heard from her. But I have an old photo of her with some of the musicians. Maybe that will help." He went to the back of the club and came back with a box of old photos. After a few minutes of searching, he found the photo. It was a black and white image of Margaret, surrounded by musicians, including Joe. On the back of the photo was written an address. "That was her address at the time," Joe said, handing me the photo. "Good luck in your search, boy. I hope you find what you are looking for." I thanked Joe and left the club with the photo and address. I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I was closer to finding Margaret and finding out the truth about my grandfather's past. While driving through the streets of Miami, I could not get out of my head the image of Margaret and Henry, young and in love, separated by life circumstances. I was determined to put the pieces of this puzzle together and somehow bring peace to my grandfather's heart. I arrived at the address noted on the back of the photo, an old but well-kept house with a garden full of colorful flowers. I felt my heart race as I walked to the door. I rang the bell and waited, my whole body tense with expectation. The door opened slowly, and an elderly woman appeared. His eyes, despite the wrinkles and the weather, still shone with a liveliness that I recognized immediately. She looked at me curiously. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Sorry to bother you, but are you Margaret Rose?" I asked, trying to remain calm. She looked at me carefully before answering. "Yeah, it's me. And who are you, young man?" I took a deep breath before answering. "My name is Lucas. I'm Henry's grandson. He told me about you." Margaret's eyes widened and she put her hand to her mouth, clearly thrilled. "Henry? Oh my God, I never did." She hesitated for a moment as if trying to absorb what I had said. "Come in, please." Upon entering Margaret's house, I felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement. The possibility of uncovering more secrets about my grandfather Henry's past made me uneasy. Margaret, her eyes bright and full of stories, led me into a cozy room where a wooden box rested on a table. She opened it carefully as if about to reveal a long-hidden treasure. "Lucas, inside this box are all the letters your grandfather sent me," Margaret said, her voice choked with emotion. "Letters I never got." My mind was spinning with this new information. "What do you mean you never got it? Who could have intercepted these letters and why?" I took one of the letters with trembling hands and began to read. It was as if Henry's words jumped off the pages, bringing out a deep and sincere love. The letters spoke of shared dreams, of plans for a future together, but also of a growing pain for the absence of an answer. "I always wondered why he stopped writing," Margaret continued, tears streaming down her face. "I never understood why he just disappeared. Until now." I felt a pang of guilt and sadness for Henry, wondering how much he must have suffered believing Margaret had forgotten him. "My grandfather always spoke of you with such affection," I said, trying to console Margaret. "He always loved her." Margaret nodded, wiping away her tears. "I never forgot him either, Lucas. I've always loved him." It was then that, among the letters, I found a picture of Henry and Margaret together, smiling, with a happiness that was almost palpable. On the back of the picture was an annotation, "Forever." Their love was real and deep, and someone had done everything to separate them. "I need to know who did this," I said, more to myself than to Margaret. But she listened and nodded.
"I have a suspicion," Margaret revealed, her expression becoming serious. "Your great-grandfather, Henry's father, never approved of our relationship. He was always very controlling and wanted a specific future for Henry, a future that didn't include me."
The pieces started to fall into place in my mind. Henry's father, my great-grandfather, must have intercepted the letters to protect the future he envisioned for his son. But at what cost? Their love had been destroyed, and entire lives were shaped by this interference. "I need to talk to my grandfather," I said, "and he needs to know the truth." Margaret nodded again with a look of understanding. "Come on, Lucas. He deserves to know that I never forgot him." I took the souvenir box and said goodbye to Margaret, promising to return soon. As I left her house, I felt a whirlwind of emotions. She needed to confront Henry and reveal the truth that had been hidden for so long. I arrived at the nursing home and went straight to my grandfather's room. He was sitting in his rocking chair, looking out the window with a distant gaze. Seeing me enter, he smiled. "Lucas, my boy, what a good surprise," he said, his voice weakened by age. "Grandpa, I need to talk to you," I began, feeling a lump in my throat. "I found Margaret." Henry's eyes widened in surprise. "Margaret? My Margaret?" I nodded, handing him the souvenir box. "She gave it to me. It's all the letters you sent, but she never received." Henry took the box with trembling hands and tears began to well up in his eyes. "But how is that possible? I wrote so many times." I waited for an answer that never came. "I know, Grandpa, and I found out that it was your father who intercepted the letters. He didn't want you to be together." Henry was silent for a moment, absorbing this new information. Finally, he spoke, his voice choked with emotion. "My father, always so controlling. He wanted me to marry a girl from a good family, someone who could secure our future. But I never stopped loving Margaret." I sat down next to him and held his hand. "She never stopped loving you either, Grandpa. She told me that." Henry began to cry and I hugged him, feeling the pain of decades of separation and misunderstanding. "Me. I always hoped that she would forgive me for disappearing," he said between sobs. "But she never knew the truth." "Now she knows," I said, trying to comfort him. "And you know the truth too." Henry took a deep breath, trying to pull himself together. "I need to see her, Lucas. I need to explain everything to her." "We'll do it, Grandpa," I promised. "But first, there's one more thing we need to find out. Why did your father do this? What was he trying to protect?" Henry nodded, still with tears in his eyes. "He's always been a difficult man, Lucas. He always wanted to control everything and everyone around him. But I never imagined he would go this far." "Let's find out the truth together, Grandpa," I said, determined. "Let's bring peace to this story." We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about the past, recalling happy and sad moments. Henry told me more about his relationship with Margaret, about how they met in a jazz club and instantly fell in love. He talked about the plans they had for the future, about the dreams that were destroyed by the interference of his father. "I still remember the first time I saw her sing," Henry said with a wistful smile. "She had such a beautiful voice, so full of emotion. I knew I was lost from the first moment." "She still has that voice," I remarked, remembering the stories I'd heard about Margaret in jazz clubs. "She still sings from time to time." "I'd like to hear her sing again," Henry said with a sigh. "I would like to go back in time and do everything differently." "We can't change the past, Grandpa," I said, trying to be realistic. "But we can try to correct the mistakes and find a little peace in the present." Henry nodded, agreeing. "You're right, Lucas. Thank you for doing this for me. I don't know what I would do without you. You would do the same for me," I replied with a smile. "Now let's find out the truth and bring Margaret back to you." I left the nursing home that night with a new sense of purpose. I needed to find out more about my great-grandfather and his motivations. He needed to understand what drove him to destroy the love between Henry and Margaret. And most of all, he needed to bring the two of them together again, so they could finally find the peace they deserved. As I walked back to my car, I felt a slight breeze on my face, as if the universe itself was telling me that I was on the right track. He was determined to unravel all the secrets and bring the truth to light, no matter how painful it might be. For Henry, for Margaret, and for myself. The anxiety inside me was palpable as I guided Margaret to the nursing home. The Miami sun was shining brightly, but all I could think about was what was about to happen. Would it be possible that, after decades, my grandfather would meet the love of his life again? And how would he react to discovering the daughter he never knew he had? Every step we took seemed to echo with the weight of memories and possible revelations to come. We arrived at the nursing home and I was greeted by the nurse on duty, a friendly woman who already knew me from frequent visits to my grandfather. She led us to his room. My heart was racing in my chest, and I realized that Margaret was also nervous. His eyes, though scarred by time, still shone with the same intensity that should have captivated my grandfather so many years ago. "Lucas, I don't know if I'm ready for this. What if he doesn't recognize me? And if—" Margaret began, but I gently interrupted her. "He'll recognize you, Margaret, and I'm sure he will be very happy to see you." I shook his hand, trying to convey confidence. We opened the bedroom door slowly. Henry was sitting in his armchair looking out at the garden outside. When he turned his head and saw us, his eyes widened. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Henry!" Margaret called, her voice trembling. My grandfather blinked a few times as if trying to believe what he saw. "Margaret, is it yourself?" His voice was weak, but full of emotion. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Henry, that's me. After all these years." I reached out and put my hand on my grandfather's shoulder. "Grandpa, this is Margaret, the woman you loved and never forgot." He tried to get up, but his legs no longer had the strength they once had. Still, he held out his hand to her. "I never thought I'd see you again." "Me? I thought you forgot me." Margaret approached and held his hand gently. "I never forgot you, Henry. Never." The two were silent for a few moments, just looking at each other, as if they were communicating through their eyes, reliving all the moments and feelings they had shared. I quietly withdrew to give them some privacy, but stayed close enough to intervene if necessary. After some time, Margaret turned to me. "Lucas, I think it's time for you to know something very important, something that I never had the chance to tell your grandfather." I looked at her, puzzled. "What is it, Margaret?" She took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Henry, we have a daughter. I raised her alone, always hoping that one day I could tell you, but circumstances never allowed it." The impact of the revelation was like an electric shock in the room. I felt my heart jump and looked at my grandfather. He was in shock, the words stuck in his throat. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice trembling. "A daughter? Do we have a daughter?" Margaret nodded, wiping away her tears. "Yes, Henry. Her name is Helena, and she's wonderful. I always wanted you to know, but I never had the opportunity. I was afraid of how you would react, how it could change your life." My grandfather began to cry silently, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "Me? I can't believe it. A daughter. I wasted so much time, Margaret. I wish I could have been there, been a part of her life." Margaret shook his hand. "But you can meet her now, Henry. We can finally be a family." I approached them, feeling an avalanche of emotions. "Grandpa, that changes everything. Now that we know the truth, we can be a part of her life. And I want to help you both reconnect with her." Henry looked at me, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Lucas. You brought the light back into my life. I could never have done it without you." Margaret turned to me and smiled, a smile full of love and hope. "You are an extraordinary young man, Lucas. And I know that with your help, we can finally be the family we always should have been." The following weeks were a mixture of intense emotions and discoveries. I contacted Helena, the daughter of Henry and Margaret. As I explained the situation, I felt a palpable tension on the other end of the line, but also a genuine curiosity. "Helena, I know this is a lot to process," I said, trying to sound as understanding as possible. "But I believe it would be important for you to meet your parents. They've spent their lives separated by a misunderstanding, and now they have a chance to reconnect." There was a long pause before Helena answered. "I need some time to think about this, Lucas. That's a lot of information at once." "Sure, Helena, take the time you need. We'll be here when you're ready," I replied, trying to hide my anxiety. While we waited for Helena's response, Henry and Margaret spent hours together, reminiscing about the past and sharing stories. The memories that had been suppressed for so long now flowed freely. It was as if time had not passed, and they reconnected with surprising ease. One afternoon, while I was in the garden of the nursing home, Margaret came up and sat next to me. "Lucas, I can never thank you enough for everything you have done. You brought hope back into our lives." "No need to thank you, Margaret. I did what I felt was right. And I also found out so much about myself and my family in the process. It's something I could never have imagined," I replied, feeling a deep gratitude for having had the opportunity to be part of this journey. Finally, we received a response from Helena. She agreed to come to Miami and meet her parents. The anticipation was huge, and my grandfather was visibly nervous on the day of the meeting. When Helena finally arrived, I felt a mixture of anxiety and hope. She was an elegant woman with features reminiscent of both Henry and Margaret. Seeing her, my grandfather began to cry again, and Margaret ran to hug her. "Helena, my daughter," Henry said, his voice choking. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there, but I'm so glad you're here now." Helena looked thrilled but also a little hesitant. "Dad, Mom, this is all so new to me, but I'm willing to try. I want to meet you and understand the history I never knew existed." The next few days were spent in long conversations, laughter, and a few tears. The connection between them was undeniable, and with each passing day, the family grew stronger. Helena shared stories from her childhood, and Henry and Margaret told about the moments they dreamed of having with her. I watched all this with a heart full of joy and satisfaction. The journey I started with a simple letter had turned into something much bigger. I not only brought to light a forgotten love story, but also helped unite a family that had been torn apart by fate. One afternoon, as we were all gathered in the garden, Henry took my hand and Margaret's. "Lucas, Margaret, Helena, I couldn't ask for anything more. You guys gave me everything I ever wanted. I know I don't have much time, but the moments I have now are the most precious in my life." Margaret smiled and looked at Henry with eyes full of love. "We still have time to be together, Henry, and let's enjoy every second." Helena held her father's hand and said, "I'm glad we found each other even though it was after so long. Now we can create new memories together." I smiled, feeling that my mission was complete. The love story of my grandparents, which began with an old letter, now had a happy ending. And I knew that no matter what the future held, the connection we had reestablished would never be broken. And so, under the hot Miami sun, our family came together, stronger and more united than ever, ready to face any challenge that came, with hearts full of love and hope.